The following program is brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Work of Human Hands on the Restoration Radio Network. I'm your host, Justin Soder, and tonight I have the privilege of sharing the air with the company of Father Anthony Cekada, Assistant Pastor of St. Gertrude the Great Catholic Church in Westchester, Ohio, and the author of the book Work of Human Hands, which is the continued study of our show this evening. Father, thank you so very much for joining us again, and welcome to the program.
Nice to be here once again.
So, Father, on the last episode of Work of Human Hands, we covered chapters 1 and 2, and we laid out some names and places and things of that nature. So for our listeners this evening, we're not going to go back over the same material. So when we say certain names and certain terminology, we expect that you've heard the first episode of Work of Human Hands. If you haven't, you can go to restorationradionetwork.com, and you can search it. It was last month, same Thursday of last month. So tonight we're going to focus singularly on Chapter 3, and there's a lot to cover in laying out just exactly how we got from the beauty and majesty of the traditional Latin Mass to the abominable Novus Ordo. So tonight, Father is going to take us by the hand and guide us from point A to point B. So, Father, in Chapter 3, you lay out the 11-step program the modernists used to take us to the liturgical disaster of the Novus Ordo. So let's start with step 1. You say that Bugnini's first step to the Novus Ordo was the 1951 experimental Easter Vigil. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. This was a proposal that was aired in the liberal wing of the pre-Vatican II liturgical movement. They had the idea of fundamentally altering the Easter Vigil, which is the service celebrated on Holy Saturday, as an anticipation of Palm Sunday. So the liturgical movement, liberals in the liturgical movement, set this as one of their first goals, one of the first steps in the overall overhaul of the Roman liturgy. So what this involved was a simplification of the rites of Holy Saturday, and to popularize them and to introduce some elements as trial balloons for a further reform of the sacred liturgy. Of course, they used the term renewed or restored Easter Vigil. And remember that this has been consistently part of the modernizers' program, that they wanted to present a change as a restoration of something in the ancient church.
Well, Father, one of the things you mentioned in part 1 here is that the bishops have been persistent in petitioning the Holy See for permission to celebrate the vigil at midnight, and that why do you think it is that they saw tinkering with the Easter Vigil or tinkering with Holy Week here, which we'll get to shortly? Why was this, to them, the logical first step towards a liturgical revolution?
Well, it was something which was, I guess, symbolic for them. The Easter Vigil services in the traditional rite, in the pre-55 Missal, had a number of very mystical ceremonies, and it was actually very long. Part of the idea was to shorten and popularize and modernize the Easter Vigil. So this was what they sought to achieve, to make things maybe a little bit more literal, to change the forms of participation, and to shorten everything and to cut it down. And this is what they did.
It's interesting. When I first came to tradition, of course, my experience was with the 62 Missal, which of course had all the modifications to Holy Week in it. And I was used to there being an Easter Vigil Mass at midnight, thinking this was the norm. So it was a shock to me to obviously when seeing the Mass, seeing the pre-55 Holy Week, that so many changes that there were, and you realize how much was shortened. And reading in part one here, I didn't realize that historically that there was no Mass offered on that day. Can you explain a little bit about why that is? Or why
initially,
that was?
initially the Holy Saturday itself was seen as a day of quiet and of meditation with an element of expectation there. And there was no liturgical service historically in the church during the day. However, what the Christians did in the early church before Sundays and before Easter was they kept a long vigil in the church from sundown to the next morning. And it was in the morning as the sun was rising that they celebrated the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass. So it was a long, very involved ceremony. Yes?
I was going to say, you finish your point. I'm going to get to something here real quick on that, but just go ahead and finish what you were going to say. I'm sorry.
So, one of the interesting points to be made is that we see this change in the time of the Easter Vigil as being promoted as a return to Christian antiquity. But actually, it wasn't. They shortened things. They shortened the ceremony for instance, from having 12 readings to 4. They shortened the litanies, cut down different ceremonies, made the whole ceremony shorter. When actually, if you wanted to restore something from Christian antiquity, you would have done an all-nighter. You would have put in 36 readings and observed the practice that was observed in Rome to lengthen the ceremony. Instead of singing the petitions in the litany just twice, you would sing each petition 7 times. So everything actually would have been longer, and you would not have had Mass during the night or at midnight. You would have had it at the dawn as the sun was coming up. So obviously what was produced in this experimental Easter Vigil was the opposite of a restoration.
I find it interesting that this language of renewed this and renewed that. I mean that sort of became the preferred language through this whole nasty period in the 1960s. And I'm wondering, was this? I mean, obviously this language was chosen for a particular reason. And do you think part of the reason it was chosen was to kind of maybe fool the laity into thinking that, who obviously weren't nearly as educated as they were, on these things? Was it a way to kind of bring them along for the program? Do you think there's a bit of a sinister motive behind it?
Well, I mean, it's a propaganda type term that renewal at this point was floated as something very good, and this continued throughout the different liturgical changes leading up to before Vatican II and then after Vatican II as well. After Vatican II, all we heard about was the renewed liturgy and the restored liturgy. So this is one of the themes for change that Dom Guéranger said in the 19th century. The great liturgist said that all of the people who truly wish to alter the Catholic liturgy speak about a return to antiquity, but they only speak about it and they end up creating something entirely new, which we know was the end result of this whole process.
Okay, so speaking about here in part one, the renewed Ordo of Bugnini, what exactly was the renewed Ordo, and what were some of the hallmark changes of the renewed Ordo for the Easter Vigil?
Well, the word Ordo is a generic liturgical term for the order of some sort of a service that some sort of service that you have. So that's the generic word. You have something that's the Ordo Missae, for instance. There were many changes that were introduced experimentally here for the Easter Vigil. You had the shortening of the number of readings. That was one thing, reduced from 12 to 4. You had the a shortened form for the conferral of the sacrament of baptism. The rubrics implied that one could actually use the vernacular for the readings, that the priest and the people were supposed to sit down and listen to the readings as they were proclaimed, and that would make no sense if they were proclaimed in Latin. So in many places you had the introduction of the vernacular. Part of the prayers at the foot of the altar, the beginning of the Mass, were lopped off. So you see parts of the Mass being subtracted. You reduce the number of prayers for the blessing of the Easter fire. Then you have new ceremonies introduced. You have the renewal of baptismal vows. This was something which was not done in the church prior to this, but everyone is supposed to renew their baptismal vows, and it's something that is an innovation that's inserted into the sacred liturgy, something that was done in the vernacular. So you have these and many other changes, many other ritual changes that were introduced.
The renewal of baptismal vows, I have to say, even at the time when I considered myself to be somebody who was vehemently opposed to the Novus Ordo and everything, that really felt out of place. It just, my antenna always kind of twitched when it came to that, because it kind of smacked of the what they call the intercessory rite of the Novus Ordo, where you have someone get up in the pulpit and you say, let us pray to the Lord for peace, social justice, and equal distribution of wealth, and the whole congregation says, Lord, hear our prayer. It just felt bizarre. It really felt out of place in that ceremony. It was sort of like you scratch your head and say, why are we doing this?
Well, see, something like that would fall very much into the category of what you'd call the modernist love for didactic liturgy. In other words, they see certain elements of the liturgy as a classroom rather than an act of worship. And by getting everyone to bark out these baptismal promises in the vernacular in the middle of the service, it's sort of the students are getting to participate. But I mean, it's
right.
Bizarre. Cretus in Deum, do you believe in God? Well, what a question to ask.
We're here, aren't we?
In fact, at the seminary of the Cone, the Pius X Society seminary, where we followed this rite, the reaction of one of the seminarians one time after sitting through this, he said, well, what a stupid question. I'm a deacon. I'm going to be ordained to the priesthood, and they're asking me in the middle of the service if I believe in God. Well, what do you expect? How do you expect me to answer? So, but it's the corny didacticism. We're going to turn the liturgy into a classroom element that you find in something like that. And we get more and more towards the new Mass, you see more of this didactic element introduced.
Yeah. So to wrap up part one here, so we could pretty much say that the renewed Ordo, this was a direct precursor of all the changes. This was kind of the camel's nose under the tent, so to speak.
Yes, and the liberals in the liturgical movement looked upon it as such. And in fact, I'm not sure whether it was with regard to this or whether it was regard to the full Holy Week changes that came 5 years later. But one of the prominent people in the movement said that if we get this particular change through in Holy Week, if we succeed in this first step, that in 10 years or shortly thereafter, we'll be able to change the whole liturgy. And of course, that's exactly what happened. What happened.
All right, so now we move to step 2 of the program here, which you identify as the simplified rubrics, which technically speaking was the reduction of the rubrics to a simpler form in 1955. So first of all, maybe to cover one small point of terminology, which I'm not sure we covered in the first show. I don't think we did. What do we mean when we say a rubric?
Well, rubric is the technical term in the liturgy for the directions that the priest is supposed to follow in the celebration of Mass, or with regard to, say, the liturgical calendar, what feast you're supposed to celebrate on a particular day, or what prayers you're supposed to say when you recite the divine office. So it's a practical direction. It's called a rubric because it's from the Latin word for red, because it's printed in the book in red. So it's direction to tell you, say this prayer, make this gesture, etc.
Okay. So, and you say the justification offered for this reform was essentially threefold. Number 1, authenticity. Number 2, conformity to ancient traditions. And number 3, pastoral fruitfulness. So, once again, we're seeing what was begun in 1951 manifesting itself again here.
Mm-hmm. No, exactly.
So,
exactly, and there are two. The last point, the pastoral fruitfulness, and so on. That was the idea of Jungmann that we talked about last time. His concept of pastoral liturgy, which he spoke about a great deal, was essentially the idea, again, didacticism, liturgy as a classroom, that you had to lower it and simplify it to the level of the people. And that was something that he saw as important. In the simplification, first of all, of the rubrics in 1955, what we had was the different directions that were given to the priest as far as what he was to do with the office, what feasts were to be celebrated, and so on. These were all reduced, and the title of the document was a reduction of the rubrics to a simpler form. So the different saints' feast days were either disappeared or were downgraded. Different other liturgical observances like octaves, which was to celebrate the a particular feast, liturgical feast, over a series of 8 days. These were reduced or abolished. So it was the sort of cutting things down in this simplification. And this is a process that you'll see throughout the whole creation of the process of creation of the new Mass. That it starts with the Easter Vigil. Then in 55 they change different things in the liturgical calendar, and they know the people who are doing this know that they have an end in mind for their process. And they tried it. It's an interesting thing to see when you see in 55 some of the things that happened in the simplification of the rubrics in 55. There's a downgrading of the feast of the saints, different feasts of the saints, in terms of the commemorations that they receive, and it's a slow process. And then you get to the point with the Novus Ordo in 1969 and the calendar changes there, where you can get through, say, a whole 52 Sundays of the liturgical year as a going regularly to the Novus Ordo without hearing one saint mentioned, except maybe Blessed Mother.
Mm-hmm. One thing you point out in this part when you're speaking about the downgrading of feasts, but you also mentioned the upgrading of the rank of Sunday. I mean, what do you mean by upgrading the rank?
Oh, by upgrading the rank of that's the we could put it this way: the issue of whether Sunday takes precedence over a feast of Blessed Mother or of an apostle. Okay, so that's part of what's called the temporal cycle. In other words, the different seasons of the church's liturgical year, like Advent and the Christmas season, Septuagesima, the Lenten season. Okay, so you have these Sundays, and this was one of the ideas of the people who wanted to change the liturgy. Let's hear less about the saints. Let's just hear about maybe the Sunday readings. So a classic example of how that worked out is in these rubrics is something that takes place during the Advent season. Now, the traditional missal always prescribed that if the Feast of the Immaculate Conception fell on a Sunday, you celebrated the Feast of the Immaculate Conception because it was so important. And the Sunday readings for the second Sunday of Advent took second place because of the importance of that Feast of Blessed Mother. Well, what happens in these revised rubrics is since the men who created them essentially had this program of downgrading the Feast of the Saints, what happens is that the second Sunday of Advent takes precedence over the Feast of Blessed Mother. So she gets knocked out on her feast day, and her feast day gets moved to the next day. So do you understand a little bit how it works?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, there might be, I've spoken with people in the past who they sort of call these changes inconsequential. They say, well, it's not really that important. But I would bring up a quote here, and we're going to be talking about Bugnini quite a bit throughout this entire episode because he is the key player here, the great architect of the new Mass. He himself said that it was not inconsequential. His quote on this document of the simplified rubrics was, quote, "No doubt it is still too early to assess the full portent of this document, which marks an important turning point in the history of the rites of the Roman liturgy." So he obviously sees this as a bridge, as something that is yet maybe another part of the construction process. I think that's evidently clear. And he also came up with something. We talk a lot about conspiracy theories about the forces that were behind the change in the Mass, and Bugnini being a Freemason, which is pretty solid, concrete, and provable. But Bugnini also gave a quote in the document, which of course sent all the conspiracy theorists a buzz when he said, quote, "More than in any other field, a reform in the liturgy must be the fruit of an intelligent, enlightened collaboration of all the active forces," unquote. Active forces.
All the active forces.
So,
I mean,
Father,
you've got it.
Who were the active forces? What's he talking about?
You've got everything there, but a pyramid, a compass, and an all-seeing eye.
Absolutely.
When you bring up the enlightened forces. Well, the interesting thing that about Bugnini that people should realize is that he wasn't speaking here, with hindsight from after Vatican II, but rather this was contemporary to the time that these changes were introduced. And he actually was the man who was the secretary of the commission who produced these changes. So he was on the inside of it, and this was his baby. So he knew whereof he was speaking when he said it marks an important turning point in the history of the liturgy, because he could see the direction it was going. And his comment about the collaboration of all the enlightened forces was published in a very lengthy commentary that he wrote on these changes, explaining why these different things were done. And it was a commentary that was essentially read only by specialists in the sacred liturgy. So the people who were really into this idea of changing the sacred liturgy, they got the message about what was going on.
Mm-hmm. For those of you who are just joining us, you are listening to Work of Human Hands on the Restoration Radio Network. I am Justin Soder, and I am joined by Father Anthony Cekada, who is walking us through Chapter 3 of his book, Work of Human Hands. We are now moving into Part 3, which is the New Holy Week. And this is something that maybe this is sort of a dividing line amongst the traditional spheres today. Those who say that the new rite of Holy Week was fine, and those who say that it was not. And Bugnini's at work here again with this. And I want to just a small point of correction that the quote I referred to earlier about authenticity, conformity to the ancient traditions, and pastoral fruitfulness was actually speaking about New Holy Week, not the simplified rubrics. However, one point that I wanted to say, Father, is that since words mean things, and Bugnini is implicitly stating when he says that the Church in her rite of Holy Week, as it was until 55, was not authentic, did not conform to ancient traditions, and the fields were barren in yielding any pastoral fruits. Why did no one ask the question when the document was promulgated? I mean, obviously Bugnini saw this as another stepping stone towards the ultimate goal, but I mean, I asked the question just as someone who wasn't alive, who tends to ask questions and be rather inquisitive of what people say. Why was no one sounding the alarm bells here, saying, "Wait a second, what's this guy really saying?"
Well, his statements appeared once again in specialist publications, and most of his readership were the liberals of the liturgical movement who agreed with him. Unfortunately, many of the Catholic clergy were not terribly well educated in the history of the liturgy, and they would not have come across something like this. In effect, this denunciation of the old liturgy. So that's kind of why it slipped by. A few specialists were aware of what was going on and were quite disturbed by what was being done. But since Bugnini was in the driver's seat, and was very, very well connected, and he was a very good bureaucratic infighter and an extremely intelligent man. He was able to get his and his friends' program through. When I see a statement like this, it wasn't authentic, the conformity to ancient traditions and pastoral fruitfulness. My question is, how did the church survive for 1950 years with the old Holy Week until he got to?
Well, that's the question. Yeah, that's $1 million question, isn't it?
So,
So perhaps, Father, you could give us a brief sketch. And this is also interesting, how things change the more they stay the same. This is now the experimental Easter Vigil was a temporary grant. Is that correct? That was a temporary grant for 1 year.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, all right.
They asked for reports on how that was going, and
sure.
Then we're at step 3 at this point with the new Holy Week.
Correct. So now we have the temporary quote unquote indult here being made permanent, which sounds a lot like things that are happening even today that people hear when, much like the topic of communion in the hand, that supposedly it was just a very limited permission, experimental permission, and then it was made permanent. So perhaps you could just give a brief sketch. You don't have to go through everything, but just a brief sketch of the radical changes made permanent in the new Holy Week.
Well, you had it starts in Palm Sunday, and historically, there was a very long and very beautiful ceremony for the blessing of palms. It was a joining of Palm Sunday was the joining of in effect, finally, of 2 masses, of the Mass for the blessing of the palms, and then you had a procession, and another Mass to commemorate the Passion of our Blessed Lord. So you had these 2 different ceremonies that were filled with all sorts of very beautiful symbolism in them. This was seen by the innovators as something that really had to be changed. Everything had to be cut down and simplified. So instead of having this, in effect, this mass type ceremony for the blessing of palms, which had a historical basis, simply there was a simple ceremony, very simple ceremony for the blessing of palms, the reading of the gospel before you have your procession. There were a number of very beautiful symbolic ceremonies, the knocking on the door of the church by the subdeacon, symbolizing Christ going into Jerusalem. Many details like this, which simply were cut off and simplified. Again, part of the Mass disappears. The prayers at the foot of the altar disappeared in the Revised Rite. The Passion account was truncated. The last Gospel was cut off at the end of the Rite. So it was, what we're doing is, we're not talking about introducing major doctrinal horrors as you have in the New Mass, but this is, to get people ready. So you have Palm Sunday. The Maundy Thursday, what was done there is the ceremony for the washing of feet was actually put into the Mass, which was something was very unusual. But then other parts of the Mass, the Creed disappeared, the last Gospel disappeared. You see this tendency to simplification too in what was done for the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament. One of the beautiful and venerable traditions that the Church had under the rubrics of the old Holy Week ceremonies was that you would have a very beautifully decorated place where the Blessed Sacrament would be placed and enthroned once the Holy Thursday Mass was completed. And so there would be lilies and flowers and all sorts of elaborate decorations to honor the Blessed Sacrament. Well, this was scorned and looked down upon by the reforms, and actually the instructions were to simplify the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament there, and then actually to cut off the adoration of the Blessed Sacrament at midnight. Whereas before, the adoration of the Blessed Sacrament was constant until the service was held the next day. So it's this sort of diminishing of honor toward the Blessed Sacrament. So that was another feature.
I don't think these are inconsequential changes, are they? I mean, these are not minute details that we're just worried about the fine print here. These are major things that are being changed.
Yes, and it's what you get is you start to see an aggregate effect of what's being taken away and what's being simplified. Then the next day there's introduced Good Friday. In effect, what is introduced is a communion service. Previously on Good Friday, you had this very mystical Mass of the Pre-Sanctified, with which the Blessed Sacrament was brought from this repository with great solemnity, and the hymn of Fortunatus, the Vexilla Regis Prodeunt, was sung as the Blessed Sacrament was triumphantly brought in. Well, that all went. That was abolished, and the deacon simply goes over and gets the ciborium, and without any particular ceremony, just brings it into the church. So you have this disappearing honor given to the Blessed Sacrament, and then you have essentially what is a little communion service, during which the people recite the Our Father together with the priest, and that is something that's a practice that's completely contrary to the history of the Roman liturgy. And you even have St. Augustine talking about that, where he says that in the Western liturgy, the priest alone who represents Christ offers this prayer. and the people do not participate in it because it is considered a priestly prayer. So you have a shift. You have a shift like that on Good Friday. So, and there are more details like this, but you can start to see the way things are going. The lessening of honor for the Blessed Sacrament, parts of the Mass are being cut out, things are being shortened. The venerable tradition about the recitation of the Our Father is discarded and cut off in the name of participation. So it's one can see the direction that this is going.
Mm-hmm. And I want to alert our listeners too. We hope that you're gonna pick up a copy of the book here, because Father goes into great detail with each one of these days, much more detail than he can spend here doing a broad sketch. But each change is laid out in numerical fashion. And you're able to get a very deep understanding at what I would call the forensic level from a liturgist as to what these changes were and what their significance really is, and why their removal is something that should really horrify all Catholics. So with that being said, Father, I think we can move on to the next part if you're ready to move forward here.
One thing I would add to that at this point, Justin, would be to build on your last comment that individually, a lot of these things seem like details, and that the change of one or two details here and there might not seem all that significant. But the idea very much is that, in fact, I quote this principle in my book, that in the liturgy, every word and every gesture is supposed to convey a theological idea. So when you fool around with these gestures and these words, you run the risk, or you accomplish the goal if you have bad intentions, as the innovators did, of changing and altering belief. And that's why these things start to add up. So with that said, we can move to the next.
Yes, which is the instruction part 4, or step 4, in our 11-step program here, is the instruction on sacred music. Now, I want to ask you, Father, why some people may view the topic of sacred music. I mean, obviously, I'm sure many of our listeners have had to endure the banal, no sort of sing-song, sappy nonsense. But so I would ask you, maybe this is a self-answering question, but I still think it needs to be asked. Why was altering sacred music so key in advancing the revolution within the Church?
Well, sacred music has a great power to reach the human spirit, and that's why the Church adopted it as part of the sacred liturgy. So it's important. Saint Augustine says he who sings prays twice. So there are all all this witness to the importance and the power of sacred music. The Church, historically, promulgated a great deal of legislation to regulate sacred music. There's a Monsignor Hayworth did a whole study in the history of sacred music, and it's really quite amazing how much constantly the Church had this concern to keep sacred music properly to convey the right ideas. So naturally, the innovators recognized the importance of sacred music, and had the idea that if you can alter certain elements of sacred music, you can alter the content of the sacred liturgy as well. So when this instruction 58 was promulgated, many of the overwhelming majority of the provisions in the instruction on sacred music recapitulated previous Church teaching on the nature of sacred music and on its importance. and the instruction contained many interesting and valuable ritual and theological points. However, the legislation also was tampered with a little bit by the innovators, and they were able to introduce, under the name of participation, some additional changes in the sacred liturgy that they hope to achieve.
You write here in part 1, under the title Advancing the Revolution, talking about the implementation, you say, unfortunately, instead of limiting its scope to musical questions, the instruction also implemented or encouraged more practices which further advanced the modernist program. Number 1, the instruction allows the congregation at low mass to participate by making vocal responses together at the various prayers the priest recites. This innovation, called the dialogue mass, which virtually unknown in English-speaking countries, but the liturgical movement in France and Germany promoted it widely in those countries beginning in the 1930s. This is something, I remember I have only seen one dialogue mass in my entire life, and it was extremely annoying. And you kind of speak to the destruction of the silence, which I think is key in low mass. What is the function of the dialogue mass in terms of advancing the revolution?
Well, we have to explain, I think, to some of our listeners what it is. And the dialogue mass, as it was envisioned by the liturgical movement, was supposed to have vocal participation by all the members of the congregation. So that was the idea. And again, it's the you can't have silence; you have to have common action all the time. So that was the idea of the members of the liturgical movement. So Americans may not be familiar with the practice, but what this would involve is essentially the members of the congregation would recite at a low mass out loud the prayers that, first of all, the prayers that the servers recite, the prayers at the foot of the altar, the Confiteor, and so on, respond to the different Dominus Vobiscums and so on. Everyone is supposed to do this together. Then there were several degrees of this. Then they could recite the Glory and the Creed together with the priest. Also the Our Father, which, as we said, is unhistorical. They could even then recite the propers of the Mass, the introit, with the priest. So this was something that you had the congregation speaking up throughout the entire Mass. So this was this idea that we're the only true participation. You can't have true participation if you have silence and recollection. You always have to be doing something, which of course people know sounds like the Novus Ordo, where they never leave you alone.
Yeah, I was getting ready to say, you start. The sculpture is starting to take shape here, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And then along with this, in this instruction, amidst all sorts of nice language from traditional documents about proper sacred music, so you have this dialogue mass introduced, and then you have the possibility of having a lay commentator who makes comments on what is going on at the Mass and who reads different texts in the vernacular at you from a book. Now, those of us who lived through the immediate post-Vatican II changes remember how surprising that was, but that actually was something that was first floated in 1958 in this instruction on sacred music, and it was permissible to do that. I remember as a kid, I of course was altar boy, and I was trained in a parish where we had a very good formation in church music and how to assist at Mass and so on. I remember going to my father's parish on vacation somewhere in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and they had one of these dialogue masses, and I thought it was the craziest thing in the world that we were forced to recite all of these prayers out loud, and that one of my father's buddies, who was a postman in the town, that he was up in the sanctuary of the church reading stuff at us in English. I thought it was crazy. It was completely different. But this was permitted.
Maybe that was the first fracturing of universality in the liturgy. That's interesting. That was one of the things I was hoping, which I outlined in the first program, that I'm glad you're sharing these experiences, because nowadays most people who are in the Novus Ordo complain that the Novus Ordo differs from parish to parish to parish, and I saw that myself, of course.
Oh yeah, sure.
And so this is probably, by this time we're at what 1958 or so here.
Yeah.
We've had several steps in the process, so now we've reached the point of fracture here, I guess. And that's very interesting.
Yeah, just for a kid, because the types of mass I was familiar with was you went to you could go to a low mass, and you had your missal with you. You say the rosary. You were taught from fourth grade on how to use the missal. There's no question about that, and that's why the whole idea that people didn't understand the Latin Mass and that it had to be put in the vernacular is ridiculous. As a kid, I understood it. I knew what was going on. I was taught properly. And so there was that. There was the low Mass, and then, as far as singing participation, we learned how to do that in Latin. We sang the Kyrie and the Gloria, the Sanctus, the Agnus Dei. We sang the Requiem Mass. We did hymns in Latin. We did some hymns at the end in English, and all with the traditional liturgy. So if you wanted to have vocal participation in singing, it's a question of just training people to do it, training kids to do it. You don't have to overthrow the whole system. But, of course, they did have to overthrow the whole system because they hated it.
Sure. Well, okay, so I don't think we can escape this topic. We're at 1958, which is a very, very important year, obviously. Okay, so this document, the Instruction on Sacred Music, was the last of Pius XII's reign. This occurred in September, and he died in October, correct?
And that's right. He was actually quite sick at this point.
Yeah, he was gravely ill. So this question here is in two parts, Part A and Part B. Number one, how do we view such documents coming from Pius XII? In Part B, it's kind of another hat tip to our conspiracy friends that they posit that there's no way that in Pius's condition, he was gravely ill, that he would have been able to scrutinize these documents as he normally would. Now, is that grasping at straws, or are we to take these things at face value? That's part B.
There is Pius XII is a very complex character, and he was, if you look at his biographies, he was wowed by people who were intellectuals, and he had a number of people like this around him. Unfortunately, they were the wrong kind of people. He had Montini, who he eventually figured out. Later, Paul VI was, his Undersecretary of State. He eventually got rid of him. But he had Bea as his confessor, who was one of the worst ecumenists at Vatican II. So he was a man who, on the level of theory, was really very good. His Mediator Dei on the sacred liturgy was terrific and unassailable in terms of principle. But when it came to applying a lot of the principles and appointing people to do it, he was not a very good judge of character. But Bugnini, in fact, says in his memoirs of the liturgical reform, he says that we were able to get these changes approved even during the illness of Pius X because of the influence of Monsignor Montini, the Undersecretary of State, and Bea, who was Pius XII's confessor. So, it's not fair to say that there was a conspiracy element in it.
The last part of this section here, and I think you summed this up very, very succinctly in describing Pius XII. You said that the modernists were patient and had figured out that Pius XII had essentially a policy of controlled concessions. that they would use to their advantage, that they would kind of patiently go along with his game, that he thought that he could keep this thing within reason by controlled concessions. Never thought about it that way, and that's an interesting point.
And the thing is, though, that I don't take original credit for that point. Actually, there was a writer who was very much in, I forget the name of the person, was very much in favor of all the liturgical reforms, and that was his analysis of it, that it was control concessions. And I think that was a very good insight. But it simply didn't work. It simply didn't work in terms of keeping the people who wanted to tinker with the sacred liturgy off of the getting them away from the sacred liturgy. They just became more and more powerful, unfortunately.
Okay, so moving on to step 5 here, we now reach the year 1960, and Pius XII has died, and now we have Roncalli, who became John the 23rd.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a new quote-unquote pope and a new direction. And so the 1959 announcement of Vatican Council II being convoked, where does this now begin to take the liturgical revolution with this new code of rubrics of 1960?
Well, this is tied in, of course, with Vatican II. The interesting thing about Roncalli is that the people in the liturgical movement who wanted to change the liturgy regarded him as a friend, as a buddy. And he had supported their efforts in a number of instances. And in fact, there's a very famous man in the liturgical movement, Dom Lambert Baudouin, who from the virtually from the time of Pius the X, in the early part of the 20th century, had been pushing changes in the sacred liturgy, and who had been trying to use the liturgy as a way of promoting ecumenism and promoting religions coming together. You put aside doctrine and you worship together. This was his idea, and he actually was quite a buddy of Roncalli. There are a number of anecdotes about that. And Baudouin was quite ill, and when Pius the XII died, Baudouin said he was ill and himself probably dying at that point, but he said that the cardinals really don't understand things. They don't understand what's going on. They are capable of electing Roncalli. And if they do, Roncalli is capable of calling a council and consecrating ecumenism. This is a very interesting insight from Baudouin. So he knew what was coming, and sure enough, that's what happened. So when Roncalli announced that he was convoking Vatican II, at that point the people who had been working on these different liturgical changes during the time of Pius XII were wondering a little bit what they were going to do. They decided to put together a code of rubrics and to summarize the changes that had gone on before during the reign of Pius XII, and to make some additional changes of their own. And so this is the Code of Rubrics of 1960, and the Missal of what is called the Missal of John the 23rd, which was published in 62. And this is the version that was approved by Benedict XVI in Summorum Pontificum. So it was the Missal of John the 23rd. So it consolidated the changes that came before it. It added even more changes. It downgraded still further the devotion to the saints in the sacred liturgy. It cut and it simplified. the legislation very much was done with Vatican II in view. That the idea was that Vatican II, John the 23rd, said was going to lay down the higher principles for a total reform of the liturgy. So it was, the 62 was an interim missal. It was not something that was made to last forever, as it were.
Well, one of the things you speak about in this step number 5 here is you said that the new Code of Rubrics was really definitively laying down the foundation for fundamentally changing everything. Mm-hmm. And you said the language of the Code of Rubrics of the Roman Breviary and the Missal of 1960 and how it differs from all codes prior. And you started to see this language creep in, language such as "it is fitting" or "it should be." This, number one, can you speak about this? It is fitting and it should be. And was this language sort of a foreshadowing of the Vatican II language?
Yeah, very much so, because what you see there is, in that sort of language, you're setting up options. You're not really regulating the liturgy. You're saying, well, it would be good if you did this. And this is the first shift as far as the language of the legislation itself. Pius XII in Mediator Dei very clearly laid out the vision of the sacred liturgy as you had doctrine, you had discipline, in other words, the rules of the church, and you had ceremonies. Doctrine, discipline, and ceremonies. So the church regulated things because every word and gesture did have a theological idea. So you didn't, prior to that, have language in the rubrics that said, well, it's fitting, you can do this, if you want, or omit it, or do something else. But you start to find then this language in the legislation of John the 23rd. It starts to appear, and what happens is that's part of the Jungmann's theory on pastoral liturgy, that you try to accommodate yourself to the needs of the people rather than have them sort of elevated to what's going on in the sacred liturgy. That's one thing. And then you get to the language of options, finally, in 1969 in the Novus Ordo, where you have a whole bunch of options that you can choose to do or not to do. So we see this opening really, first of all, in the legislation of John the 23rd.
They kind of use Bishop Sanborn's airplane analogies here, which I love. I mean, it's kind of like, could you imagine going to an airport and you're wanting to go to London, and you're wanting to get on the right flight to go to London, and they tell you, well, it's fitting you should take this flight to London. You could take this flight to London, but you don't have to.
Or they could say that it's fitting that the plane has all 4 engines that work.
Sure.
But
absolutely.
The pilot, that's left to the discretion of the pilot, and if he wants to go with 3, 2, or 1, well, fine. Whatever is fitting. So
it should be fueled up, but it doesn't have to be fueled up.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be. So.
Okay, so lastly, Father, let's identify one other name here who popped up in this section, and we'll see further down the road here. Who was Father Carlo Braga, and what was his role in the
very
liturgical revolution?
Character. He was not. While in the history of the New Mass, people identified certainly Annibale Bugnini as a bad guy and a heavyweight, and as a major influence in the destruction of the traditional Mass. Braga was someone who actually had a great deal to do with it, and was in fact very influential. He, like Bugnini, was of Vincentian, and he was younger than Bugnini, and he served as sort of his assistant in the preparation of the liturgical reforms during the 50s, and he wrote the Code of Rubrics for the Missal of John the 23rd. So he pulled everything together for that. And he was also involved in the creation of the new Mass. Again, he functioned kind of as Bugnini's secretary. He was a total modernist. He was the one who was responsible for writing the 1969 General Instruction on the new Mass. This was the introductory document that had the ritual instructions, but also had the theological ideas behind the new Mass. And this had the infamous definition of the Mass as an assembly, as an assembly of people, rather than as a sacrifice offered to Almighty God. And this was the definition that sent so many good and faithful traditional Catholics ballistic, because they said rightly it was heretical, it was modernist, and it was Lutheran. And it was Braga who was responsible for that document as well. So both for the rubrics of John the 23rd and for this heretical 1969 General Instruction. So he was a significant player, and even after the controversy over the General Instruction, he still defended it. Wrote articles defending it. So he had his finger in the pie with Bugnini.
This program was brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org.